Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be touching on a very serious and controversial issue, and that is the UK immigration debate. And I'm going to be giving you guys my thoughts on this, and I'm going to be touching on some issues that I don't see anybody really talking about, or not issues, but points. Yeah. Um, Now I am going to come at this video from three perspectives, right? From three main aspects. And that is the job market, the housing market, and the NHS. There are going to be some other minor areas that I'm going to touch on, but they are minor, okay? Um, Compared to these main three ones, these are the three main issues that I think people bring up or have when it comes to immigration, or not really issues, but um, so most people would have issues when it comes to these three areas, but there are also people who view it as a good thing in these aspects. Um, Now, I want you guys to first of all take a look at the graph that I've put in the background of this video that you're looking at now. Right, so that shows you net migration to the UK over the past 30 years or so. Um, so this is gross migration. But I'm going to give you guys a rough breakdown of net migration to this country over that same time period. Now, before 1997, net migration, right? So that's the amount of immigrants minus the amount of immigrants, or the other way around. So the amount of people leaving the country minus the amount of people coming into the country, or the other way around, was 50,000 per year. Now that is a very sustainable, good number, I would argue, especially for a small country like the UK. And it's within our limits as a country. We can sustain that, right? That's what I would argue, at least. However, since 1997, when Tony Blair got in, net migration has been in the hundreds of thousands. And before around 2016, before Brexit, it was 2 to 400,000 a year net, which is already quite high. But that was with mainly EU migration. But then after Brexit, it shot through the roof. Right, immigration just went up and up and up. Net migration, I'm still talking about here. And I mean, it has been coming down somewhat, but it's still at like 400,000 a year, which is, very high. Now, this is a. I'm going to start on this by touching on the job market. Now, the reason, in my opinion, why a lot of young people are struggling to find jobs isn't just because of AI, not needing workers, right? That's not the main aspect, especially now. We're still quite early in the advancement of AI. I would argue actually that a major driving force of this is immigration. Like a major aspect of the job market is immigration, because when you're competing with the whole world, because the brightest and like this country wants to hire the brightest and the best from abroad, of course, and they want to come here because they work for, like, I don't know, 5 to 10 times the wages, right? It's perfectly understandable. And but the problem is, when you do that, right, you oversaturate the job market to such an extent. Of course, it depends on what field you're in, but you oversaturate the job market to such an extent that young people are going to struggle to find jobs. And I mean, there's also less incentive to work, because that there will always be someone more qualified than you willing to take the job, right? This is a very important factor that nobody really talks about. People are starting to talk about it now, but especially before, like, I don't know, 5 years ago. Like this really started in the 2020s, but in the 2000s, late 90s, 2010s, if you talked about this, you're kind of seen as racist or, something like this. Um, but I would say that when it comes to most sectors of the economy, the reason why a lot of young people are, and not just young people, people in general, are struggling to find jobs is because of mass migration. There are simply too many people in the country nowadays. And another issue is regional inequality, which exacerbates this. So everybody wants to come and live in um, London and the southeast, right? Everybody wants to go and live in that part of the country. But the problem is, right? There's only so many. There's only so many people that one city or one part of the country can sustain. And when that part of the country may be, growing economically at least due to immigration, right? You see the growth on the charts, but you don't necessarily see that translated. So that part of the country may overtake the rest of the country, and that exacerbates regional inequality. But because the elites and the people with money are just in the capital, they see less need to invest in other parts of the country, which exacerbates regional inequality. At least that's my perspective on it. Um, Now, another aspect of this is, another aspect of this would be, um, so I've touched on the job market, I think, um, and I would argue that a more sustainable plan would have been to build some kind of, cheaper railway system, like high-speed rail system, like they have in most European countries, like maybe say HS2, um, and build towards that instead of relying on mass migration because it's just unsustainable for the long-term development and well-being of a country. Um, that's my argument at least, right? And you would have mainly say northern workers coming down south to work for cheaper wages, for higher wages. Um, that's my argument, but I'm going to leave that for now. But I would argue the reason why a lot of young people are struggling to find jobs is because of that. And of course, there are other factors, especially nowadays. But in the 2000s and 2010s, immigration was the main factor behind this, and especially in the lower skilled job market, which is where most people are. Secondly, um, the housing market. So I would argue that here pressures have almost entirely been caused by migration. Now, um, when you look at this, right, um, there is enormous pressure on the housing market in this country, enormous, especially in London and the southeast, of course, because as mentioned earlier, that's where most people want to go, right? Most people want to go to that part of the country because that's where all the jobs and economic opportunities are. But the problem is, right, when you have that as a starting point, right? When you have that as a starting point, what does that mean? It means that the houses that already exist, which are already quite limited because of things like housing rules, building regulations, which in this country are very strict, um, and other factors that I'll get onto later. Um, I mean, this is a relatively small island. If we have mass migration, net mass migration, mind you, that is going to cause immense pressure on the housing market. Then basically what that means is that there's going to be a lot less jobs and houses for young people. Rents are going to go up because of the pressures, and that's just going to cause a lot more stress for everyday people that live here, that were born here, raised here, etc. And of course, a lot of this, this is pretty much, at least from what I understand, almost exclusively caused by mass net migration. And I don't think there's another argument that can really be sustained. I mean, sure, you have the building regulations, but if you start building houses everywhere, that in and of itself is just going to lead to a lot of challenges, right? There's going to be, I mean, you're going to have to build a ton more infrastructure, and you're going to have to find a ton more jobs, and the economy is going to have to grow a lot, which is going to put pressure on, public services, and just people's lives more generally. But yeah, I mean, the reason why rents are so high, at least in my opinion, and the reason why people are struggling to find houses, struggling to find, these basic things is because of mass net migration. I think that's undeniable when you really look at it. Um, so I might come back to that. I don't think I need to, honestly. But yeah, that's my analysis on the situation. Those are my thoughts. And lastly, we have the NHS. Now, of course, a lot of doctors in the NHS are foreign, they are immigrants, and they are necessary for the upkeeping of the NHS. But I think a big reason for that, because there is this argument that, and maybe I should have touched on this on the job market bit, but whatever, I'll touch on it now. There's an argument that Brits won't work for, certain jobs, certain wages. Now, some of these can be automated in the cases of, say, I don't know, fruit picking or whatever. A lot of them can't, like, say, care workers or people like this, right? Now, that's understandable. I would argue that's an understandable point. However, in this country has not been training, we have not been training our domestic workforce. We don't have any real systems in place. All of the emphasis is put on the academic route, which is not for everyone. I would argue it's not for most people, actually. And instead of training people with real skills, the government has just relied on cheap labor, right, from abroad, and to an extent that's necessary. I would argue that there are certain jobs that Brits won't do. However, I would say that is massively exaggerated. I would say, especially when you're looking at, say, the north of the country, or workers from, say, Wales or maybe Scotland. I don't think it's that big in Scotland, but Wales, the north of the country, the Midlands, they would be willing to work a lot of jobs that immigrants are working now, especially in the NHS, right? But back to my point on the NHS. So when you have net migration in the hundreds of thousands, right? Like say 400,000 net migration a year, which we have been having for the past 30 years, give or take, then the amount of pressure that creates on the NHS, which by the way is a relatively simplistic system compared to, say, the French system, right? So there's only so much it can handle, to the point to where it's free at the point of service. Right, but when you have mass migration, it puts immense pressures on waiting lists, on waiting times, which you see in the UK. I think there's like a couple of million people backlog when it comes to the NHS, which is a problem. And I would say a large part of it has been caused by mass migration, because I don't think before 1997 you were seeing anything like, the backlog numbers that you have now. It's just gone up and up and up over the past 30 years. And sure, some of that is attributable to poor governance, but the vast majority is caused by the factors that I talked about earlier, by mass migration. So, yeah, that's something important that I think should be touched on. Of course, immigration is very good for the how should I say, for a lot of immigrants work in the NHS, basically. However, if this country had a program of training domestic workers, I think that the amount of migrants required for the NHS would be much lower. Of course, all this depends, this is all hypothetical, but I would argue it's better to just train your own domestic workforce. I mean, especially in the north, some of the employment rates up there since Thatcher shut down the coal mines have been abysmal. And I think that's a major reason behind it. But yeah, so these three major aspects of life in the UK are under enormous strain due to mass net migration. Now, I wanted to touch on infrastructure as well, and this is not a major point, but it's an important one. Now, when you have, let's take a look at the UK, especially London. When you have, like, this country, the infrastructure systems in this country were built 200 years ago, or over 200 years ago in some cases. I say the London sewerway system, for instance, which I think is the oldest one, was built 200 years ago, right? So already we can see that it's going to struggle to sustain a massive influx of people, right? And as this city's population has grown by a few million, oh, sorry, not this city, but London, right? Uh, as London's population has grown by a few million over the past 30 years, 35 years arguably, then what does that do, right? It creates enormous pressure on this aging infrastructure, right? And there are going to be a lot more. There's going to have to be a lot more repairs. It's going to cost a lot more public money. These kinds of concerns. Um, yeah, so that's something as well. Also, overcrowding of trains, overcrowding of buses on the way to work. That's another major factor to consider, right? I mean, you know, um, I would argue that the vast majority of UK cities are just overpopulated, incredibly overpopulated. If you live here, I think you know that, and so I would argue that that's a major factor. I mean, traffic jams in the morning as well have been increasing incredibly, and I would argue that here's my argument, right? If you have controlled immigration, right? If you have lower rent prices, lower housing prices, all this kind of stuff, which are horrific nowadays, then you can begin to tackle issues such as homelessness much more effectively. You can spend a lot less money doing it as well, which is very important. You can tackle a lot more issues relating to crime, antisocial behaviour, because there's more money and more resources available to do it. What else? Yeah, so yeah, I mean, there's just a lot. You can spend more money on infrastructure projects, right? You can develop the country. There's more incentive actually to develop the country, as I touched on earlier. And you can upgrade infrastructure because there's much less pressure on it, right? You can spend more time and money upgrading said infrastructure, and you can focus on improving the quality of people's lives that are already in the country, rather than prioritizing mass migration, which is definitely not sustainable for the long term. Definitely not. Now, of course, there are definitely advantages to immigration, and especially when you have an aging population society as you do in the UK. I guess you could say mass migration, although I think this is overstated, but mass migration is definitely going to help with. It's definitely a good thing to have, right? Because there's always a supply of labour on hand. However, as this is something I don't hear people talking about too much as well. When it comes to, how should I say? Yeah, so when it comes to mass, how should I say here? Yeah, so when it comes to this topic, right, as the rest of the world ages, we're not going to have that reserve pool of labour to rely on, right? So that's something that's very important, and I don't really see people talking about, but it's very important as well. Like, as the world ages, we're just not, and as the world gets richer, right, less and less people are going to want to emigrate, right? So yeah, and another issue as well is this regional inequality, right? And so I think that a lot of immigrants are going to want to come to London, but not the rest of the country, and I think that could be a turn-off point to a lot of people. Um, you know, so yeah, that's what I would argue, that this is something very important that I don't see people touching on. Now, when it comes to other aspects, right? I mean, sure, there are other aspects of the job market that are having an impact, but I would argue that when it comes to this, because a lot of people, especially on the left, think that a declining population is a bad thing. However, I personally think that's a great thing for the factors that I mentioned earlier, because when you have a declining population, there's a lot less pressure on, the job markets, the housing markets, on, healthcare systems, on infrastructure, and you can plan for these things more effectively. Of course, you don't want catastrophically low birth rates like in a lot of Mediterranean countries, South Korea, Japan. But I would say that the UK has never really had that problem. This country's birth rate has never really, I mean, until very recently, but this country's birth rate has never really dipped below 1.7. So yeah, that's something as well. I would argue that that birth rate long term is good for development. That's what I would argue, because another thing as well is that we have so many problems in this country that the government is unwilling or unable to sort out. So I touched on, the NHS, I touched on the housing market, I touched on regional inequality, which is arguably one of the greatest problems in the UK. Regional inequality here is really bad. I mean, if you don't live here, you probably don't know, but it's really bad. The government is not investing across the whole country, right? Partly because there's not really too much incentive to do so. I mean, why would you care about the northeast when you have a growing economy in London that is always going to be growing? But I would argue that given these factors, then that's eventually it is going to come and bite us in the backside, if you guys know what I'm trying to say. So yeah, it's just not sustainable long term for these reasons. Now, yeah, so you're better able to say take care of homelessness as well, although there is an issue of a lot of homeless people, although I'm not 100% sure about this, but from what I've heard, a lot of homeless people don't really want to get housing, be a part of society, and that's up to them. But I mean, there are so many homeless people nowadays, and people that shouldn't even be homeless. Normal people that are, they are actually homeless, like they're on the streets, right, because of a lot of these factors. Or there's another issue as well when it comes to temporary accommodation. Like the UK has a homelessness crisis, but in regards to a lack of permanent accommodation, and this is a very serious issue. And I believe that if you had much lower numbers of net migration, this is something that you could, it would barely be a problem. I think. I mean, it would be much less of a serious problem, and you could build newer infrastructure, newer housing, without so many pressures. But what I've noticed is that in the UK, there's always some construction going on, especially of housing. Do you guys notice that? And it depends on where you live, but especially in London and the southeast, there's always some kind of construction going on. Always, 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 because pressure, right, due to immigration. So yeah, I mean, these are my arguments about immigration. These are my thoughts about it, because, and a lot of these topics you don't really see people talking about, right? But I would argue that that just shows you that political discourse in this country is very immature, and it's not really, serious, which is a shame. But whatever, it is what it is. But yeah, I would argue that the issues of regional inequality, high-speed rail, these things needed to be addressed. But the time for these arguments, especially when it comes to say immigration, was 30 years ago. Excuse me, it was 25 to 30 years ago. Now, it's kind of not too late, but like net migration has been way too high for decades, and a lot of these talking points and discussions are kind of irrelevant because it's already happened, if you guys know what I'm trying to say. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. But I just wanted to say, if I do see any kind of hateful comments, disrespectful comments, they're getting removed. If I see any, any negativity, towards me in the comments, it's getting removed, right? I wanted to reiterate that policy because I don't know how many views this video is going to get, and a lot of people may be new here, so and this is a touchy topic, so I just wanted to get that out there. But anyways, see you guys later.